welcome on into a special interview edition of Spotlight right here, part of the Brasserie Media Podcast Network. I'm Zack Heydorn. I am your host, and I'm joined today with a really special guest, someone that I'm just so excited to talk to, the author of the upcoming Macho Man, The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage biography that will hit shelves on April 2nd, Jon Finkel. Jon, it is wonderful to talk to you, man. I'd ask for you to give your best Macho Man impression right now, but you're going to do so much of that in the next few weeks. I'm going to let it go.
Oh, yeah, it's just good to be here, Zach.
Yeah, there we go. All right. Man, what a story. What a biography. What a piece of work. I just finished reading this the other day, and I really thought it was excellent. Talk to me about just what went into writing this, from kind of the point of creation, or like the idea, to actually getting finished. I know, with the book that I wrote, it was quite the journey. So I'm excited to hear kind of like what that path was for you.
Yeah, this is my 10th book, so my fourth or fifth biography. And so I kind of have it down now, a little bit of my routine and my pattern for doing these. I know that it is a year to 18-month slog. I know the parts where I kind of lose energy, and I know myself, like my writing biorhythms and what I need to get these books done now.
Yeah.
And so from to the first part of your question, just I've wanted to write this book since I wanted to write books. Like since I was a wrestling fan my whole entire life. I used to call myself Little John Studd after Big John Studd. I used to go to all the matches and watch every Saturday Night Main Event and the cartoons. And I had the Macho lunchbox and the action figures and all the Hulk Hogan stuff. So I was all in from 6, 7, 8, 9 years old to now. And so it was always a book I had in the back of my mind to do. I've written biographies on some NFL guys, NBA guys, and some of the sports like that. And I was writing my book before this was called 1996, a biography, and it was like a biography of the sports year of 1996. And I wanted to do a biography on a person after that, and I wanted to do Macho. And so I felt like I wanted to be respectful of how big he was and really do the job. And I think earlier in my career, I was a little intimidated by it because there's just so much there, and he's so iconic. I didn't want to screw it up. And there's biographies where, you really have to immerse yourself in the world and know what you're doing. So there's no way this book could have been my first book. I'm glad it was my 9th or 10th because I kind of knew the ropes. I knew how to handle the interviews and the research and go back to everything. And I mean, it's 100,000 words. And as you know, you write 200,000 to get to the 100,000,
right?
That matter. So yeah, it was something I've always wanted to do. And that my road to was basically like, it was a bucket list biography for me. And when I got to the point of my career where I knew I could tackle it and do a good job, I was just thrilled that no one had done it yet, basically. And it was my turn.
Early in the book, or before you even really get into the meat of the book, you talk about wanting to get, his brother on board and, his family on board in terms of just being a part of the project. And, I think that in hindsight, it was such a smart move because, Lanny is able to really give a perspective on it, almost from the perspective of Randy himself, but not, obviously not really. And so obviously he's going to protect Randy's legacy and all of that. But I thought he really did lend like that historical, personal nature. So talk a little bit about, that mindset of like, all right, I have to get him involved. And then what went into actually securing him? To be a part.
The mindset was my first thought was it from a brother perspective. My brother and I are very, very close. He lives near me. We see each other all the time. And for some reason, somebody wanted to do a book about me. I could never imagine them doing it without talking to him. He's been my best friend throughout my whole life and knows more about me before I started doing anything than anyone else.
Sure.
And so I kind of looked at it from the brother perspective first. Like, okay, he's alive, thankfully, but he's the only Papa who's alive. Randy didn't have any kids. There's no other brothers. And so that was my first thought, was like, you can't write this book without talking to Randy. Then on the credibility side, it was, well, if I choose to write this book and somehow don't get in touch with him and move forward, the first question anyone who knows anything about wrestling will ask is, did you talk to Lanny? And I felt like if the answer to that was no, it just kind of goes wah, wah, wah. Like, well, how do you not talk to the guy's brother? Like, not only were they in the same industry And, not only were they both like come up together, but he's a veritable historian of modern wrestling who happened to be the brother of the guy. Like, so there was just no way I could do it without him. And I was, not that it was it was my own ultimatum, but I was prepared to just not do it either until he said yes or until I could find a way to get him involved. And so the way I got him on board was I had interviewed a guy who runs Pro Wrestling Stories, a great website named JP Zarka, for 1996, because in 1996 it's a landmark year for all kinds of sports, but also for wrestling. It's the year, as you know, Stone Cold made his debut as ringmaster or whatever it was in WWE, and the first year The Rock came out as Rocky Maivia. So pre 96, there was no Steve Austin and there was no The Rock in WWE. I know there was Stunning Steve and all that, and
sure,
but for the larger WWE audience, those guys didn't exist. And I reached out to him because he had done like a podcast with Lanny a few years even prior to that. I said, look, I have this whole proposal done. I have some publishers interested. I can't move forward without at least pursuing this. So he's like, yeah, no, I mean, he's really reclusive. He lived in Ecuador. Like, it's not easy to get a hold of. He doesn't say yes to a lot of things, and be prepared for like a long wait and or no response and or just, a very curt response. Not how he is. And so it was a long wait. It was like a year. It was DMs back and forth, then some Facebook messages. And every month I would be like, is this going to happen? Is it not? I started writing other books and other ideas. And then finally, JP was amazing. He stayed on him even to the point where I was like, am I annoying you and you're annoying him? Or are you? He was just great. And he was kind of vouched for me eventually. And was like, I'm going to set up like a 5-minute call. If it only goes 5 minutes, great. He'll talk if he's interested. So you'll know. And so finally it was a call through, like, I don't even know. It wasn't even Telegram. It was some random thing that you could get in Ecuador through.
Wow.
I used my landline with like a 75-digit number. It was ridiculous to get a hold of him. But when I finally did, he was, I've seen all the videos of him and I watched him when he was leaving Lanny Paffa. So it was kind of cool. And then he asked me if I was related to Howard Finkel, obviously the famous announcer. And I said, no, but my dad's name's Harvey Finkel. So the same initials. So maybe there's something. He laughed. He was like clever coincidences, obviously, as the genius and all that. And then we just started talking and he hammered me with a bunch of questions about Randy, I guess to see if my chops, if I was the guy to do it. And we talked for like 2.5 hours. He answered every possible thing I could have asked and agreed to be available as things came up. Because I talked to him. I'd done the proposal, but, I'd only talked to a few people. I'd planned on talking to hundreds. And I knew as those conversations would come up, more things would come up. So he was available for that. I had a sheet on my desk right here called Lanny Cues that I would email him or text him occasionally. And then the next time we were scheduled to talk, I had found out right before that he passed away. So I'm very glad he was, I guess gave me his blessing and was, excited that I was doing it. I don't pretend to know him super well beyond, our few conversations about the book, but he was very much the steward of their legacy, very proud that, no one had kind of flubbed it. He had his issues with those documentaries and things that came out, and he was excited that like this would be a definitive kind of objective look, but also from someone who understands and appreciates what Randy accomplished from baseball and through, wrestling. And so I, bummed now that I'm out here talking about it. It kind of re-bums me out that he isn't here. I dedicated the book to him because I think he really enjoyed it. He was a well-read guy too. He liked books, so this would have hopefully been one of his favorites.
That's such an interesting. I just think that's such an interesting story because he is like the steward of that, not just Randy's legacy, but the family's legacy in the business, too, that has such deep roots, which you get into. And like, I'm just curious as to that, like, what did you use to like map out like the family history in wrestling? Because you go back to like his grandfather and
Vern Gagne and all Vern
Gagne and even like a little bit before that. And it's just, that's a time where, there's stuff out there to see and there's stuff out there to watch. But so much of that is like, so much of the history of that now comes through the lens of like current day wrestling. Like WWE owns a lot of it. Like there's just a lot of like filters that history has gone through. But I thought you did, like, the book does a really nice job of teeing up the fact that pro wrestling is in Randy's blood. Like, and you don't really get that until like you're a little bit into it, until after he like passes through like the baseball phase. But like you really set the table early on that like, hey, this is, yeah, Randy was this huge, larger than life superstar, but boy, he's able to be that because of what his family did. And so talk a little bit about just going backwards and starting so much earlier, before really getting into the meat of the Randy story itself.
Yeah, well, thankfully, and anybody probably under like 25 listening to this is going to be shocked, but there used to be a thing called newspapers. And these newspapers,
wait, what are those?
they were these things that were printed up daily and oftentimes twice a day, all throughout the country in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. And especially in the territories where they worked, and in Chicago and Indiana, all around there, and then eventually in Kentucky and all that, there was 4, 5, or 6 newspapers per like municipality, and they covered local events. And one of the most popular local events, especially in the Midwest, which is why there's so many wrestling territories there, was wrestling, right? And so when I went back into the archives, newspapers.com is great, and there's a few others. You can follow, especially early Angelo's, like his debut and all the things he was doing, stories on Vern Gagne and Bronco Lubitsch and all these guys that he came up with. The papers were that day's Twitter. And I mean it in the sense of there might be 4 stories on that night's wrestling. So you'd flip through the sports pages or entertainment, and there'd be a local wrestling, show coming to the Armory or coming to your town fair, or they would do high schools. I mean, it didn't matter. They'd pack in 800 people, 1,200 people, and it would have all the matches and what was happening before and the buildup. The promos, right? There's no, you have The Rock cutting a promo for WrestleMania against Cody. We have all this stuff now. The promos back then were newspaper interviews, and it would come out about, why, because Angelo was a big time heel, and it would come out as why he was a bad guy, why he was hated, and who he was wrestling and what was going on. And so, Randy came up essentially reading about his dad being a bad guy. And so some of my favorite things that Lanny was explaining to me and other things when I'd find research is like, I have a son, my son's 11. Like, I'm about the age, a little older than that. Like, it'd be really with that, that Angelo was when he had Randy. Like, it would be bizarre if everywhere you went, you were with your kids and your dad just got booed and heckled and hissed out of arenas. And you're like, no. This means I'm doing an excellent job. Like, boos or cheers. Think of them as cheers. But it's hard when, like, you're standing there and someone says to your dad, like, he sucks, you suck, like it must still feel weird. So they had to go through a lot of that. Randy had a lot of fights in school because this was, closed circuit TV, local TV. Like, there was nothing on. There was 6 channels, and one of them every Sunday night or Saturday night or whatever they would put it on would be wrestling.
Fascinating. So I enjoyed particularly the stuff about his baseball career, and obviously, like, not from like a wrestling perspective, but you really get a sense of, to me, like the obsession that Randy Savage had for what he was doing. And in the early part of his life and his athletic career, it was baseball. You talk about him just constantly practicing, constantly in the gym. Like, he had, the goal of being a major league ball player. And like, I think it's really interesting to hear that story, which there's not a lot out there about his time playing baseball, but how that obsession applied to him as the Macho Man and like the obsession with that. And so, what was it like to unfold the baseball story? And do you agree that obsession like really showed? Was it insight into his personality that made him such an effective pro wrestler?
Yeah, Randy's baseball career, the way he approached trying to become a pro, the reason I spent that much time on it, I think it's fascinating. I mean, it's like there aren't really many people who did what he did and had the level of success in a pro sport and then went on to be the icon that he was in wrestling. But also, it sets the stage for his maniacal commitment to success. And the two things in baseball that I like were just endlessly fascinating to me were the idea that in high school, this is before the 5-star videos. People have to remember the time. Like, everybody's so immersed in. You can go on Instagram and see every kid highlight reel down to like Little League World Series is on TV. Like, none of this existed. This was just a small town. Downers Grove was not, he wasn't playing outside New York City. It was outside Chicago, but it was not like this haven of baseball talent, even though his high school ended up producing 2 or 3 pros from that era. Mm-hmm. But the craziest thing about it is that they built a batting cage on the side of his house. this is an insane thing to do. And he not only uses it to become a better hitter as a righty, he batted like as a junior 520 or 540.
Right.
He spends the summer learning to hit lefty. And then he ends up batting 510, 520 as a senior from both sides of the plate. Like he just continued to improve. And then when you move even beyond that in his baseball career in minor leagues, when it was almost over for most players, when he basically broke his collarbone and couldn't throw with his right arm, he decides, I'll just learn how to throw lefty. I have two arms. And he actually prolongs his minor league career for almost 2 full years because he learns how to throw like a passable. And they all say it was a funky motion, obviously, because it wasn't his dominant arm. But he throws 1,500 balls against the side of a grocery store every morning to like for 3 or 4 months, 300,000 balls lefty, just so that he could stay in the show because he could hit. They all say he could hit. It wasn't like he was, devoid of talent. But ultimately he was like a C plus at all 5 tools. And he could hit a little bit. He could run a little bit. A couple of the guys say in the book, like if hustle and heart were just all you needed, he'd be Babe Ruth. But yeah, that part, the way he was obsessed, like is a perfect word that you used. It was almost an OCD level obsession where he blocked everything else out. And the reason I think it's so important in his overall story and the book in general is that when he takes the turn to wrestling, you're now set for like, this is what this guy's capable of to achieve a dream. And he just takes that, turns it up even more, and just goes after wrestling.
Yeah, because wrestling is like it brings out that side of your personality inherently, whether it's there or not. Like, because you have to be on the road and you have to be in shape and you have to be, competitive and constantly like fighting for your spot. And so, like, I was reading it, and in some ways, it's like, wow, this fits Randy perfectly, this business. But in other ways, it's like, man, this is the worst thing for him because it placates all of his like intense tendencies.
Yeah, he has a quote in there where it's like he talks about how baseball, you go 2 for 4 and then you have to wait the next day and it's a different pitcher, you can't even get back at the same pitcher. Like he would wait. There's stories in early on even his high school career where he would walk and then argue the ball 4 because he wanted to still hit.
He wanted to hit, yes.
He'd be like, take your base. And he's like, no, throw it. Like that was him as a kid. And, the personality part is a lot of guys, almost all of them to a man, are like, he was a quiet, unassuming, driven guy. Randy wasn't Macho Man yet, even Savage yet. But yeah, there's stories where it's like you can see that he's got this stick of dynamite inside of him. And then wrestling allowed him on the personality side. But again, as you read, like he created all of it. That's what every time I went like section by section through his life, I had to keep stepping back and reminding myself that he wasn't following a playbook. It's easy now to start reading the book, and when I'm starting to writing it, to know where he ended up and how big it got. But I had to keep saying to myself, like, dude, he was not like, this was not like, okay, now you're going to become Randy Savage, and then this is what's going to happen, and then you're going to start wearing this kind of stuff, and then you're going to do this kind of thing, and he just made it up. It was every time he needed a little turn or a pivot, whether it was outfit, voice, clothes, personality, bit, whatever, he developed it. So he's just an incredible talent.
Yeah. So I think like, Randy's story, as a wrestler, especially in WWE, WWF, it's out there. Like people know like the path that he took and how big he got and some of the, the huge matches, the stuff with, with Steamboat and the Hogan feud, obviously. Is there like, what did you, in terms of like diving into that deeper for like the book and like just his whole kind of time in that company, what are some takeaways that you learned that, that surprised you about him at that time, and maybe that you don't see, or you can't get a sense of watching just the angles and the matches play out on TV?
Yeah, I think that I grew up at the perfect time frame for this. So, WrestleMania 3, I was like 7, 8, like I was all in. So I was the perfect age. I believed, there was no gimmick for me. This was like, I believed when he and like Ultimate Warrior had their retirement match, like I believed whoever lost would never wrestle again.
Would never wrestle, yeah.
I was 10 or whatever. Like that's, my dad wasn't going to ruin it for me. Like that was what I believed. I believed that he and Ms. Elizabeth got married. Like I believed that they were, I didn't know they were together. I was 11 years old. Like I had no idea at SummerSlam. That was a moment for me. Like, oh my God, they're finally getting married. And on that front, to answer specifically, one of the things that like I found interesting, and a lot of wrestlers touched upon it when they did all the retrospectives when he passed away. But like, I had known that he never left character, and I had known all that stuff. But I always had thought there was a difference between not leaving character, but leaving like the gimmick behind. Like, yeah, he could always be that guy. That was fine. But leaving like how people felt about him behind, and like understanding that the audience reaction was to the character and not him. But there's a section in here that I with him and George the Animal Steel. That was one of, like, as a kid, I remember my crazy storylines were like the simpleton George the Animal Steel was in love with Elizabeth, and every time you looked at him, you didn't want him to attack. And there are these moments where either he psychologically got lost or just got confused. But there's several backstage incidents where like George would leave with Elizabeth per the audience, per the script, per everything to incite the crowd. And he'd be like, "What is going on? Where is she back? What are you doing with her?" And they'd be like, "What do you think? What is the audience? They're thinking exactly what you want them to think, that this goofy Neanderthal type guy is taking her from you, protecting you from being the bad guy. Because remember, like, you're a heel still." And he was like, "What do they think he's going to do to her?" He'd have these moments. And the wrestlers like Paul Roman, some of these guys who were very down the middle, not too into their characters, their character was 80% who they were, and they kind of just understood it was a job, would be like, "What the hell is wrong with it? Do they think that he's concerned that George Steele is going to take her back here and like have some kind of romantic thing with her, like in front? Like, what? Like, relax, dude. Like, you set this up. You wanted this. This is perfect for your character. It's perfect for next week's show. It's exactly the heat you want to draw. So what the hell's your problem?"
Yeah. I mean, that kind of, like, again, that goes back to like a little bit of that OCD obsession, like a part of his personality. And it kind of leads me to my next question, which is, how in writing the book, I mean, obviously you're a fan of Macho Man, and we all are. How did you balance the fandom with some of the harder parts of Randy's story? There's some drug use in there with steroids. There's the stuff with Elizabeth. There's, the stuff with Hogan. I mean, like, it's not all like, it's not all roses.
Yeah.
How did you handle that as an author, and to make sure that you got that stuff in so the book was complete and full, but, recognize it at the same time? I'm a fan of this guy, and for good reason.
I think that it helped that I'd done, this is one where definitely it helped that I've done a lot of books, and you have to do that. There's I spent my early part of my career writing cover stories for magazines. So mostly as a journalist. I started early, and before that with newspapers. So I have a very more core of a journalism background. And so that really wasn't a struggle for me. It was really like one of those things where this is who it is. I felt like I used my sort of fandom hat to really get people who maybe didn't grow up at that exact time, or maybe started following him at WCW or later, to really understand what he meant and why he meant so much to so many of us. And I think I did a good job of being able to take it off and really look at, like, I mean, he was psycho. He was a guy who punched holes in his apartment walls and, made people miserable with his intensity, and made him drive all over the place if he had to do, there's a story with this guy, one of his the ICW guys, Bill Martin, in there, where he would make him, drive 6 hours to go to the gym that he liked to overnight so they could work out in the morning, then drive back to shows. Like, he was a nut. But so I think just being more of having written a bunch of books under my belt, there's no thought of not including that kind of stuff in there. And you have to write a balance. The goal is to write the full story of Randy, and that stuff is part of who he was.
Yeah. And talk a little bit about just like what you learned about him as like a businessman in professional wrestling. Because I mean, he got to the highest of high levels. I mean, obviously, in the ring, he had his moments, certainly, of, like I said, the Steamboat match and the WrestleMania 5 angle with Hogan. And maybe you can touch on that in a little bit, but also just like, as a businessman, I mean, the stuff with Slim Jim, I mean, just the new ways that, like, he made money with his character. Like, he was a trailblazer in a lot of ways as far as that goes. So talk a little bit about what you learned about him there, and if and what about previous parts of his life like impacted his ability to do that.
Yeah, I think that from the business side, his dad was Angelo Poffo, who had a character called the Miser. He was famously one of the cheapest human beings in the history of wrestling. every interview about him, every quote that exists about him somewhere mentions how unbelievably cheap he was. I mean, he'd pack 7 guys into one motel room somewhere. He would drive farther than he had to for gas. He wouldn't let guys drive above 55 because that was like the perfect mileage for tires and gas. The tread didn't go down too low and the gas didn't get burned too fast. Like, people didn't know if they would ever stop to eat. And if they did, it was like a loaf of bread and bologna, get back in the car. Like, this man did not pay for anything unnecessary. And it was kind of helped, if you listen to a lot of the guys I talked to, kind of was part of the demise of the ICW. Is he didn't spend on equipment. He wouldn't spend on promotions, certain areas. He spent on terrible TV time, not prime TV time. He bought crappy rings. He wouldn't grease the palms of the people to get them in Rep Arena and other things. So there's a couple of those guys, George Weingroff and some others, who pretty much say, like, if he just opened his pocketbook a little bit, like, we might have been all right. Now, who knows? Maybe we wouldn't have gotten Randy in the WWE, and who knows? But from a business side, that's his main influence. Like, spend nothing. And to Angelo's credit, he's one of the few wrestlers from the 40s and 50s who built a life and raised a family and didn't go spiral off into bankruptcy. Even Gorgeous George, who was selling out Madison Square Garden in the 50s, was bankrupt when he
had
died.
nothing. Yeah,
Angelo paid for his funeral. Like, so a lot of these guys had nothing. So Angelo, famously, like, put his money into AT&T stock. Like, he just, he took care of his family. He owned a house. He had raised kids. He planned on putting them through college. He had gone to college. So that was Randy's background. He was also smart. I think, it's easy to just look at him and think it's a character and he had this wrestling talent. But he was an honor student in high school. Hacksaw Jim Duggan told me some stories where he would just clean guys' clocks and chess. Like, you couldn't touch him in chess. He was a poker savant. The only way he survived in the minors was to take the poker off the bonus babies. Like, all the guys who were better than him who got these big contracts, Lanny was like, he got their money. He didn't get it in the contract, but he got it in poker. Like, he was sharp. And so he knew how to leverage all this stuff. He knew when to spend, unlike Angelo, on the, on the big, gowns and the dresses and all the stuff he bought. Not dresses, but all the dressing that he had all around him. Yep. And so when he was able to capitalize with his contracts, bringing Elizabeth up was really, really smart. They were married. It was pooling income. Like, it was also that, right? They wanted she wasn't the first choice. She was beautiful and she worked, but they had other choices they wanted to bring in as his valet or as his manager. And so, he had that business acumen from his father. And I think he did learn what not to do in many ways from his dad, the way he treated certain things. And he was also famously cheap. He kept all his money to have options. And by the time he made it to be champion, he has a quote, I can't remember which newspaper, where he's like, now it's fun. The stress of the money, I've achieved what I want. I'm financially secure. Now it's just the drive to stay on top. And I would have imagined, earlier, if that had happened, when he really needed money and was living with Rip Rogers in these just dumpy, 1 futon, 6 barbells in a condo, it might have been a different attitude. So he was able to really focus on growing the character. So business-wise, he was brilliant. I mean, he maximized it. You can see him, if he had come up now as one of those guys who has a production company and a licensing company and, is printing his own T-shirts, not WWE T-shirts. You could have seen him do that if he was a modern day guy. So I think he really showed some of these younger guys how you can not only own your character, but take it to something like Slim Jim. Because he did, when he was champion, I didn't know this, so I did all the research, but like, he was almost the face of Mountain Dew for a little while. They had a Mountain Dew belt for like the Slam of the Night. Like, he was involved in all of these things. And then, the Slim Jim obviously took off beyond what anybody would have expected, but he had set the stage for that to be the case.
Yeah. I mean, you see a lot of, even now, like, when they do like the, product integrations, like a WrestleMania with like Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I mean, like, the first thing I think of about that is the Slim Jim thing. I'm like, that was, Randy was kind of the first one through the door on it. This is kind of just like a general kind of more question for Randy's biographer than it is like specifically about the book. Yeah. But was Randy misunderstood when it came to Elizabeth?
I think it's going to sound so meta, but like, I think he misunderstood himself when it came to, I think everybody around him understood that he was nuts. And, Elizabeth and him probably at some point when it finally boiled over shouldn't be working together anymore. It did everything he wanted. It brought them together to New York. They could live together. a bunch of guys had tried to bring their wives on the road with them. It didn't work. Maybe now with the trailers and the first class, like it would probably, you have Becky Lynch and Seth Rollins. You have some of these couples that are together, and it seems to work even if they're on different brands. But the problem then was it was not the lifestyle. It was a very much pile on this Greyhound, pile on this flight. You're on all the time. You're going to do TV and a show and then another house show and another house show. It was not a place. I think Hacksaw said his wife became very good friends with her because she did try to travel with them for a while. And, it was a place for the boys. There was no place even in the locker rooms for her to change. It was often like her and, like nowhere to go. It was her and someone else's wife would go over here to try to, find a room to change in.
Sure.
So I don't think he was misunderstood. I think everyone else knew the score and they knew that he was nuts. I think if there's anything, he probably had fooled himself much longer than was noticeable to anybody else that it was working still, and it was fine. I guess they tried to have somewhat normal lives. They would finish the shows and go home, and they would go to the hotel and watch TV and do all these things. But she lived a very closed life. She didn't have friends on the road, right? I mean, who was she going to do? Like, well, confide in, Tito Santana. Like, I'm sorry. Like, you know what I mean? Like there was like they had acts they were doing there, and it was very like, I think it was happy and then sad, and then when it finally broke up, it was about time to happen.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, listen, last question. Well, two really, but one of them's probably pretty short, I would imagine. Was it fun like reliving WrestleMania 5 and writing about that time for Randy Savage? Because in a lot of ways, I mean, that's like peak Savage, and that's such a huge, memorable angle and memorable feud and memorable WrestleMania. I mean, it's just such a big part of like WrestleMania lore. So was it cool revisiting that from, Randy's eyes?
It was like the most fun I've ever had writing a book. And for two reasons. Like I said earlier, my son is peak age I was. So my son's 11, just turned 11 this last week. So most of the time I was writing, he was 9 when I started, 10 throughout most, and then just turned 11. And it was the age I was at WrestleMania 3, 4, 5. Like he watched all of it with me. And because of, WWE on Peacock, so we just went through the order. They have Saturday Night Main Events on there, especially on YouTube. And he like reliving it, not only as myself, like I got to like remember all those moments. And, with YouTube, people will post on Twitter or something like, oh, it's the anniversary of, Hulk Hogan picking up Andre the Giant, or the anniversary of, the snake bite for Macho. You'll see these little moments, but they're not in context of like the match or the storylines. So to be able to truly in a condensed period of time, we would just spend like hours just binging all this stuff while I'm taking notes and coming up with questions for who I'm interviewing. But to be able to do it with my son, who was the age where wrestling took me over for me and is taking over him. He's got, Cody and, LA Knight and all his guys now. And I watch with him too. So I have my dudes too. But it was the best thing ever to be able to share all of my wrestling childhood with my son, who's now of perfect wrestling age. I know we're still into it, but he's just starting to get that, like, it's chosen. Like, why would they do this? Why would they do that? But for, the LA Knight thing drove him nuts for a very long time. He had that was his like wrestling maturity moment, because he's like, I don't understand. He's the best. Can they just have him win? Now it's like he's a star again. But like for a while he was losing. He lost like 20 matches in a row. And my son was like despondent. Like let the megastar be the megastar. To finish that story, the greatest thing that I think happened for him to like kind of grow up a little as a wrestling fan to understand the score was, remember last year, this time, in fact, every LA Knight promo was, you can't have a WrestleMania in Hollywood without LA Knight. And then they did. And my son was like, at the end of watching both nights last year, I remember he turned to me at midnight or something. It was like, wait a minute. They had a LA Knight. They had an LA WrestleMania without LA Knight. And I was like, let me talk to you about wrestling, son.
I mean, it's so sweet and so innocent, but everybody has that moment. Everybody does. Everybody does.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh man, fantastic. Well, the book's called Macho Man: The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage. It's out on April 2nd, wherever you can get your books. Jon, thank you. Leave us with one thing that you were surprised about with to learn about Randy Savage, and what should people really know about him as a wrestler, not even necessarily as a man, but just as a wrestler? Like what surprised you writing the book, and what do people need to know if they know one thing about Randy
Yeah, I
Savage?
think most people look at the guys, look at Stone Cold, look at The Rock. They're big dudes. They're big dudes in high school. They're big dudes in college if they went to college. You look at these guys. The Rock looked 35 at 20, right? Like you
Yeah.
look at these dudes. They're obviously wrestlers and massive men. I mean, Hacksaw Jim Duggan was a monster offensive lineman. Like the guys of his era, Hulk was 6'7" at it. These guys look like wrestlers. You standing in a line at the airport, you're like, that's a wrestler, that's a wrestler, that's a wrestler. Randy did not look like that. Randy's baseball life, he was a 6 foot. I've gotten specific 6 foot 6'1". A lot of people will say 6'1". A couple of the wrestlers who wrestle with him say 6'1", 6'2" in shoes. Like he was not a big guy, but he was 185 pounds. He had spent years building a sinewy, quick ball, quick body, quick core to be able to hit in baseball. So he put on 40 pounds, and I just had never thought about that. Now that I'm about a little bit shorter than that, just around under 6 foot and about 200. So I know 185 to 225 to 240 is an insane physical transformation to make. And so when he first started wrestling, he was putting on the weight as he started. So he went out there, and even Lanny, when Randy was ready to start wrestling, Lanny was 6'2", 240. So he had 60 pounds on Randy when they were practicing, right? So he looked like nothing. When you hear about some of these guys who saw him for the first time, Dusty Rhodes was like, how is he going to do this? He's a skinny little nothing. And so to me, the physical transformation he made, because I'd never thought of Randy before Macho Man Randy Savage. I didn't know, he basically went from a skinny teenager in my mind, to this guy. And I didn't realize there was no in between. He literally was like, okay, now baseball's done. I'm going to spend a year just packing on muscle and transforming into this human. So the specific part of your question, the thing you remember is he built the Macho Man. He created it wholesale from scratch. He did not have a naturally large frame. He did not have a naturally boisterous personality. He did not dress naturally flamboyant. He literally went into the lab of his brain and created this character that we beloved. And hopefully the book shows you that whole story and does it justice.
It really does. The book's called Macho Man: The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage by Jon Finkel. Jon, thanks so much. Good luck with it. Hopefully, we can have you on soon, and maybe there's another wrestling project in your future. But thanks so much. How can people follow you on any social media or anything like that to stay up with your work?
Yeah, great. The best thing is I have a newsletter called Books and Biceps. You can find it, just the sign up link on that, on Twitter at Jon_Finkel. Also, my website, jonfinkel.com. I've been running this promotion for all the pre-orders. So for your listeners also, if you buy the book and you send me a screenshot of the order to either my Twitter DMs or whatever it is with your address, I have these really cool, they're these hologram stickers of the cover. So they look awesome. And then I have book plates to sign also. So if you do buy the book, anyone listening, buy it. I hope you do. Wrestling books need to keep being made, so buy these wrestling books, as you know. And if you do that, I'll send you a really cool hologram sticker of the cover, signed book plate. Just DM me a screenshot of the order, and I'm sending out about 70 today. So every day it's been about 50 or 60, which is awesome. So keep them coming.
Awesome. The book's out April 2nd. Jon, thank you so much, man. Great. It's a great book. I highly recommend it to all of our listeners and viewers. So give it a shot. Jon, thanks.
Thank you.